Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of a Tuesday talk show. So this one's going to be a little bit different in that I don't plan on framing this around Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud as much, or on psychology in general, because I'm in the stage of the game where art is the sort of main theme of the dungeon and the antagonists and stuff like that. And the new party member, come to think of it. And we'll be talking about all of that in a sort of separate part of this video, because the topic that we're talking about, art, is a little bit tangential to the actual concept, but I think it's an important one for me to discuss, because a lot of my review content and a lot of my discussions and more in-depth analysis of things has a lot to do with my perception of art and about video games and so on and so forth. So what I need to first talk about is the fact that this is going to be a very much language and philosophy of language structured discussion. And the reason for that is that the fight about art and games is not really so much about whether or not we're not really arguing about art here. We're not talking about the core of art. What we're talking about is ultimately a fight of semantics, of words, of definitions, and trying to figure out just exactly what the word art means. Because if video games are art, the reason that we can make that assertion is going to have to be because the word art contains meaning that means that games fall within that definition. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can sort of structure or categorize or analyze words, and we need to sort of look over those different methods of doing so. First of all, of course, is the most simple method, that is simply to use the dictionary. And pretty much every site that discusses, every person on the internet that is going to try and discuss this topic and is going to try and support the idea that games are art is going to reject the idea that we can use dictionary definitions. And the reason that they're going to do this is primarily because the dictionary does not support the idea that games are art. We can look up one of the definitions right over here. So the one that is going to be useful for us is the mass noun, that is to say, the reference to all things that fall within that category. The expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Now, let's break down this definition just a little bit. Video games are an expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, so we're fine up to there. Typically in a visual form such as a painting or sculpture. Now we're technically still fine here because it says typically in a visual form, and it is a visual form such as, so it does not exclude other forms that are not paintings or sculptures, so still we're safe here in this part of the definition. Producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power, and this is where we find that the dictionary definition discludes video games and a lot of other things, and we'll sort of get into what else this discludes right a little bit later. So the problem with this is that these works have to be primarily appreciated for their beauty or emotional power, appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. So video games have beauty and video games have emotional power, but it would be a stretch and would simply be dismissed by the vast majority of people, including most gamers who are being honest with themselves, that we are appreciating video games primarily for their beauty or emotional power. We are primarily appreciating them for their interactivity and for their gameplay elements. There are some games that I would argue fit into the dictionary definition, but these are ones that people are primarily rejecting as being games at all. And that would be games like Dear Esther or Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. These games are primarily for their beauty or emotional power, and that means that they do fit this classical definition of the word art. And I think that if we are going to accept this definition and we're going to reject games that fit this definition from being games, then we really have no leg to stand on when we want to say that video games are art. But we can sort of get around this by saying that, you know, the dictionary definition doesn't really fit with it and we should reject it. And this, I think, is fine. There are plenty of cases where the dictionary definition, being very, very rigid and very structured, isn't really helpful for the conversation and what we're discussing here. So what else does not fit into this definition of art? Well, movies do not fit into this definition of art. If you watch a movie, you're not watching it primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Again, there are exceptions. There are plenty of movies that you actually do watch primarily for those, but we're actually often watching movies for their narrative structure or for their action or for anything else. Their character moments, their character development, their dialogue, the jokes, the action, any of those sort of things could be a reason why we primarily watch a movie. There are going to be some, again, that do fit this definition of art, but there are plenty of movies that do not. And lastly, people also point to kinetic art which is designed to be interactive. In a lot of cases, these are not actually very good looking or emotional, so many of those ones might fall off the spectrum, but that sort of lends itself to a level of subjectivity. And the thing about a lot of them is that I find that their primary draw is actually novelty. A lot of them try to do something that is kinetic, but in a way that is untread by other artists. That's not really my sort of take on what art should be in terms of the dictionary definition there. So if we're producing sort of art that is also postmodern, or in this, like let's say for example you go to an art gallery, you see like the pure red with a black stripe through it. This also does not fall into this classical definition of art. It's not primarily to be appreciated for the beauty or emotional power. It's supposed to be appreciated for the sort of interpretive ability of you to sort of project an idea onto the other onto the artist. That's generally speaking what those are for. I don't really actually have much appreciation for that style of art, and I find that most of the people who make it are hacks, but that's just me being incredibly cynical about that entire art movement. But even at the best of times, it's supposed to be interpretive. It's not meant to be really beautiful in the sort of classical sense there. Now, could be, again, some that incorporate that idea of trying to have like that sort of self-representation on the canvas and convey that sort of raw artistic emotion or whatever, that bullshit they sort of talk about. And it could end up being beautiful in consequence just because of the way that they've done it. It could be compositionally very, very skillfully done. This just doesn't happen to be the case for many of them. So again, we're seeing a case where some of it could be art and some of it might not be. And lastly, we have to talk about the classical art, the very, very old style, old school classical art. Paintings, sculptures, stuff like that, prior to it being very abstracted. These, again, are going to be much trickier, and we have to start thinking to ourselves the question of authorial intent versus the audience's interpretation of it. Because there are plenty of paintings that are meant to be beautiful or appreciated for their emotional power, but which fail. And the question is, does the author's intent at having tried to make it a beautiful piece of artwork make it art, or does the fact that it has failed disclude it from the category entirely? We have to realize as well that this argument doesn't really extend to games, because the intention of games is not often to primarily be beautiful or emotional. That is, generally speaking, not the primary motive for video games either. But when we talk about art, like, there's a lot of motives that go behind making art. But whether or not they sort of succeed or fail really sort of changes the way that we have to perceive that. And second of all, if it's about the audience's perception of it, then we end up in this very sticky situation of the definition not holding much meaning, because if it is devoid completely of authorial intent, then we end up in a situation where literally anything fits the definition. Anything that has been created by a human, whether on purpose or even on accident potentially, could be argued as being fitting of this definition. And the reason is that if we're saying that it merely depends entirely on the audience's finding of it beautiful, audience finding it beautiful, well, there's always going to be some contrarian asshole that finds literally anything beautiful in an aesthetic sense there. So because of the fact that it just means literally anything is art in the eyes of somebody, the word, it becomes devoid of all relevant meaning there. So I do think that it has to be based on the authorial intent as to whether or not it's art. We just have to simply accept that something which tries to be beautiful and completely fails to be beautiful just is bad art. We can actually have that idea that there is such a thing as bad art, which is art that fails to properly fulfill any of its categories, despite the author's intent to do so. So, okay, let's take a step back here. What have we done so far? Well, we've basically just unpacked the reasons why I think a lot of people don't like the dictionary definition of art. We have to realize as well that art is in a state of flux and has been for quite some time now. You could say that it started shifting ever since Pablo Picasso. You could say that it started at Andy Warhol. You could say it started at Marcel Duchamp. It depends on your sort of point of view of when we started veering away from the classical idea of art as a representation of beauty, and it being sort of your ability to express yourself emotionally onto the canvas. And I think that to me, it's the anti-art movement that really started this going. although I think that if we didn't get Pablo Picasso, we wouldn't have the sort of trend in the first place. But Pablo Picasso's works are still designed to be aesthetic. They're still designed to be beautiful. You then get to the point where you start seeing people bolting fixtures of like toilets in the middle of art galleries and calling it anti-art. They wouldn't necessarily have called their works art. They're trying to make a commentary about the state of art when they were doing this, or some of them were, and some of them didn't get the joke. But to a certain extent this is not art anymore. This is where we start seeing like that hard divide of there are people putting things in art gallery that are not art. And they appropriately enough label it anti-art, so that is kind of helpful in that perfect sense there. But we start seeing more and more of this sort of idea as we progress past that point of view. It's that question of what is art that was being asked during that time. Why does it have to be so restrictive? Why does it have to be beautiful? What is art? And this was the sort of high-minded nonsense that people began asking. And we haven't reassembled the definition of art from that period of time, and we definitely do need to. And I think that there is merit in changing the definition away from the dictionary definition's viewpoint. But at the same time, I also think that we could potentially keep the dictionary definition of art, have anything that falls within that definition be art, and simply create a new term and a new meaning for anything that falls outside of it that would otherwise be in an art gallery. For example, the painting that is an ugly red canvas with a black stripe through it. We could have a new term for that style of thing that is not art, or we could try and find a new definition of art that includes that. So I think that you could go in either direction, and I think that we're still in that position of trying to decide what exactly art is. In other words, there's been a deconstruction of the genre of art, but there has been no reconstruction of it up to this point in time. And I certain as hell am not the person to do that. I'm definitely not the person who's going to cobble together the different elements and figure out what we're going to say art is at this point in time. Because there are so many people who are all claiming to be doing that, but none of them are really succeeding at gaining any traction. And so we're in sort of a lexical limbo with the word art and its intended meaning and the way that it's interpreted by other people. Alright, so where does this leave us? Well, we've now got sort of other options that we can explore here, and we'll take a look at some of them right now. First of all, we need to think about redefining the word art, and I think that this is something that lots of people are going to be willing to do. The dictionary definition of art is extremely defunct. Not only does it not describe the word in a way that satisfies the majority of people, I don't think that it includes everything that everybody, like there's no person on earth where they would look at that definition and say that this includes everything that fits my idea of what art is. So I think that it does actually need redefining to a certain degree. And the other way of looking at it, though, and the one that we'll be taking our first look at, is the idea that language is dictated by simple common usage, how people use the words. And I think that there are plenty of people who have made the argument that usage of the word art in a specific way has made it so that games are art, but this isn't actually true. The reason that people believe this is that they are part of an echo chamber, that is the gaming community and the internet community at large. These are all people who are willing to say that games are art, or at least the majority voice or the loudest voice on the issue is that games are art. However, the vast majority of people are either going to not have an opinion, they won't care about it either way, or they're going to say, no, games are not art, if you go outside of that community. So when we say that language is derived from the community's usage of it, it does actually refer to small communities. It doesn't refer to everyone in existence. For example, art only has real meaning in English-speaking languages or other languages that have something that sounds the same. And those don't always sort of mesh with each other, even when you do have different languages that have similar-sounding words, because they aren't necessarily related to each other, but that's a bit of a tangent. So this is a slightly problematic way of expressing it, and it's also not particularly useful for the reasons that we want games to be art. So we have to realize that when we say that games are art, and that the reason that we're fighting for games to be considered art, it's a political statement. It's a political stance that we're taking. It's not simply a definitional one. And while we need to sort of concretely get the linguistics down, if we want anyone to take the argument seriously, or for the argument to be valid in any way, shape, or form, ultimately we have to realize that we're making this argument for a politicized reason. We're trying to make people concede that video games are art because art has a certain level of legitimacy attached to it. It's allowed to talk about subjects that video games aren't without being criticized. It draws different attention from the media. If we talk about like news, if we talk about television, if we talk about movies, all of these are discussing video games in sort of a derogatory, limited capacity. And to a certain extent, we believe that there are people who believe that if video games are art, then this will stop, or that they shouldn't do this because video games are art. And the problem with that is something I'll go into a little bit later. But for now, let's just assume that we need to convince someone outside of the gaming community that games are art. And by someone, I mean actually a hell of a lot of people. Ultimately, the demographics that are important to influence are people like politicians, people in old media are important to sort of discuss in that sort of context there. And, well, mostly for another group, parents, people who are talking to their parents, for example, and want to buy whatever video game. They're going to say, well, that's not very appropriate for you to have. It's not it's just a game, so why don't you just get one that's more appropriate. So for younger kids, it's also something that they have a bit of a stake in, because, if parents believe that games are not art, if they believe it's just some other thing, then they're going to just dismiss it offhand and not let it serious ones into their house, or ones that deal with violence or any other thing like that. So we need to realize that we're not trying to categorize video games as art to convince our own community that video games are art. That's really redundant. It's not necessary. Even if 100% of video gamers believed that games are art, that wouldn't really change anything in a relevant sense there. It would just be an entirely self-masturbatory experience there. So what we need to do is realize that if we're going to do this, we have to look at the broader community. And when we look at the broader community, we realize that video games are not art, because again, they fail to capture the idea that these people are willing to accept games as art. They simply are not willing to do so. And this usage is one that we can still work with, because we can change the perception of video games as art. The way that we would do that is potentially to highlight or showcase specific pieces that have more artistic merit, whatever the hell that actually is. Honestly, it's difficult to categorize what artistic merit even is, but we can sort of gradually draw people's perception in there, or we can simply wait until everyone that's old dies. That would also work. Generally, linguistic shift can happen just from waiting until people die off that use the old sort of definitions and words. And once that happens, it's very likely that the common vernacular for art will include video games. But in any event, that doesn't really help us in our current situation here, and it doesn't necessarily add any legitimacy to video games as a form of medium. You'll notice that the debate for movies as art happened before the majority of our time. It happened in some people's times that are still alive and around, but they were arguing that movies are art, and it hasn't always been the case that movies were accepted as art. They went through much the same phase. But to a greater or lesser extent, the people who did not view movies as being art, they're all gone now. However, we end up in this sort of weird situation where movies are still movies. Like, they're still mass consumer trash for the most part, which is designed not to be artistic, if that actually means anything, but rather just to be exciting, to be scintillating, to be interesting, and to make lots and lots and lots of money. They're not really trying to do any of the things that art has traditionally tried to do. So I think that to a certain extent, even though movies are now considered art by a lot of people who are willing to discuss that topic, who have an opinion on that topic, they don't really have any of the appreciation that, real, air quotes, art actually has. If we were to talk about movies, they're still pretty heavily restricted. They've still got that sort of age rating. If there was an actual painting of some event that had some sort of depiction of violence, like, say, the death of General Wolfe, well, that's of cultural significance, and that's something that most parents would let their kids see, even though it depicts a violent death on it. I think that to a certain extent, that's not really true for movies. If you see a movie that depicts a violent death in it, a lot of parents are going to be like, oh, well, that's not really important. Like, movies are just movies. People don't need to see that. They're not a culturally significant thing to see. We can see that there are certain exceptions to this. A lot of parents let younger kids see Saving Private Ryan despite the R rating. And that's because it was culturally significant at the time. And I think it still to a certain extent is. But you'll notice that I said that Saving Private Ryan was culturally significant. Is it art? I would say not necessarily, despite sort of the way in which it has impacted and influenced Western media and Western society. I think that to a very large extent, Saving Private Ryan is not really necessarily art, but it is an amazing movie. And here's where I have to go into a bit of a tangent. I think that we're fighting the wrong battle by trying to recategorize video games as art. I think that we're simply perpetuating a cycle, and I think we're also perpetuating a cycle from a losing position here. because the people who are trying to sort of claim that what such and such a thing is art is to a certain extent very interlinked with news and media, and that's where, for example, parents get a lot of their messages from. They don't get their messages about what things are and what things do and what sort of impact they have on today's youth from video games. That's not where you get that information from. You get that from TV talk shows, you get that from movie stars, you get that from the news. And so I think that we're trying to argue this from a losing position by contrast to movies, where Hollywood movie stars would commonly go on talk shows and talk about the newest, greatest fad diet or whatever and influence lots and lots of moms out there or what have you. I think that the message is being controlled by the people who don't want video games to be considered arts to a very large degree. And they're controlling it in such a way that, the message is going to the right people. Video games message that video games do have artistic merit and do need to be discussed and taken seriously and be given that form of self-expression that other mediums have is largely going out to other gamers. It's a platform that it is not expressing itself to the correct audience if you want to get that message across. And I also don't think that there's an easy way to get that message across to the other subgroups in human society from the stance that we're currently situated in. So the other thing that I would say is that we need to question whether or not art has any inherent significance to it that allows it to discuss or describe these controversial topics, or to avoid sort of censorship or anything like that, any more than any other form of medium. I think ultimately, if we just focused on describing the situation as all forms of medium, whether they be art or not, needs to have equal representation and allowed equal creative freedom and equal cultural significance, that would be a much more meaningful and impactful debate, and one that means that when we get to this next cycle of things that come after video games, comes after comic books, because they're still in sort of the similar state, I think, to a certain extent, we end up simply solving the problem on a much more permanent basis. The idea is that every generation says, well, whatever I liked is, legitimate, it's art, it's important, it's culturally impactful. Whatever those damn kids like is just entirely irrelevant. And we're doing the exact same thing. We're trying to legitimize our specific niche interests, and we're doing it in such a way that we can say, yeah, look at all our things, they're art, they're impactful, they're meaningful, but we're doing it in such a way that we can still say that other forms of media are not legitimate. We're sort of allowing for that continued subject and that continued talk through every single time that this comes up. And we keep saying, like, one of the arguments is that, oh, this debate happens every time. It happened with rock and roll music, it happened with movies, now it's happening with video games. Well, we need to not look at this as being symptomatic of video games not being art. We need to look at this as being symptomatic of people fetishizing certain forms of entertainment at the expense and exclusion of others. And we're doing the exact same thing in this particular argument here. So what we should actually be arguing is that not only video games, but all forms of media are capable of addressing difficult subjects and capable of being culturally significant. And I think that if we started doing that, the debate would be very different. I don't think that people would agree off the bat there. But at the same time, I think that they would be able to bring up and dredge up a lot of counterexamples within video games. But here's the thing, we can also dredge up tons of examples of counterexamples within movies of things that are not culturally relevant, which are not capable of handling their material sensitively or in any sort of constructive manner. And I think that ultimately what we have to describe is that the ability to do this doesn't lie in the medium itself. And so there's no specific merit, for example, to art. It's just that we sort of associate it as having that. But there are plenty of art pieces that should not be allowed to sort of express what they have, or if they are expressing the way they are, we should sort of shun it. And this does from time to time happen. Like there was an art piece of someone put a blender out there with a fish in it, just a goldfish, a live goldfish. And you could walk up to it, you could press the button and blend the goldfish. And it was a living goldfish until you blended it, obviously. And, something like a couple of goldfishes got blended, a couple of them got stolen. They would just keep replacing it. And eventually it got censored. It got taken out of the art exhibit by angry people and animals rights protesters and the police and all that other stuff. Because this was, by technical definition of the law, animal cruelty. And it being art does not protect it from, animal cruelty in this particular case. So, there's plenty of times where art is trying to express something in a way that is either maybe it's ham-fisted or it's outright illegal, or, we need to sort of tone it back in some way or another. And, this just goes to show that not even art, not novels, not anything, is capable of always fitting in the ideas that we need to be expressing, or fitting into that sort of general consensus of what is or is not appropriate to be displayed in medium. And it has less to do with the medium itself or the topic itself. It has far more to do with how that topic is approached, how that topic is discussed, and how we use that sort of content or that medium to represent that, if it's done respectfully, if it's done intelligently, or if it's simply done to shock or offend people. And to a certain degree, I think people are nowadays just saying that, oh, well, shocking and offending people is the point of whatever it is we're doing. Typically speaking, if you're doing that, you're not really getting any sort of message across. You're just pushing away people from your message, so it's not really that useful a tool if you're trying to make some sort of social commentary, and it's honestly just not really that interesting to me in any event. It's like, oh yeah, you're trying to be shocking, how original, blah blah blah. Mostly because, you know, anyone that tries to do that isn't being original. It's been done before. I might just be jaded because I've seen a lot of sort of nonsense, but I think that, you know, there's probably some people out there that are very, very easily offended, and those people are still not going to really get your message, nor are they going to care about your message, nor are you expressing anything intelligently. You're just offending people. And if that's all you want to do, then what you're doing doesn't really need to be called art. That's just the simple matter of it. It's easy to offend people. Anyone can offend someone. So, you know, if that's your goal, just don't call it art. Just call it something else. It doesn't really matter to you. So anyway, now that I've sort of gotten that aside, let's take a look at the last way of looking at art, and that is redefining art. Right, so the last way that we can sort of conceptualize this in terms of my video here, because there's a limited amount of time and there's basically an unlimited number of ways that we can conceptualize this, is through the redefinition of the word art. And I do actually think that this is a useful way of going about this, because art is due for a revamp in its definition there. How far we go is up to other people, and whether or not we decide to reject that and start teaching people what art actually means in terms of the dictionary definition is going to be up to other people. I honestly have no authority on that matter and don't intend to have any authority on that matter. But what I can say is that art, as people use it in the common vernacular, when I say that I'm going to an art show, I'm going to buy a piece of art, I'm going to look at some art, I'm going to an art gallery, when I say any of those things, I say that I'm going to look at art. I'm going to be dealing with art. I'm going to be exposed to art. All of that has with it a conception that is not necessarily coherent with the dictionary definition of art. And that is partly because we no longer view art as being an aesthetic medium, which I find personally to be unfortunate, since I prefer art that is aesthetic over modern art. But you know, I guess if people like a red canvas with a black stripe through it, then that is perfectly whatever. But I mean, for the most part, we have a conception of art that does not really have any sort of concrete ties to beauty or emotion anymore. And I think that that's going to just have to be taken into account when we redefine art, or when we conceptualize the way that we think of art. But we can't also say that our conceptualization should, by default, include video games. If I were to talk to a person and they were being honest, and I said, I'm going to an art show, and then thought about the things that go through their mind when I say that, none of them are going to say that, you know, even in the top 100 of things that you might be looking at includes video games, unless they're so uncultured that they can't even think of 100 paintings. Although I think that actually might be the case, that there are probably people who can't even think of 100 paintings. Well, specifically naming 100 paintings is an actual awful lot, but this is a bit of a tangent. I'm just basically saying that, like, art, when we say that we're going to an art show, we have an idea of what that person is going to go to. And this is sort of going into the idea of sense and reference, which I think isn't necessarily the most popular way of analyzing linguistics, but I think it's useful here for looking at the sort of core that we need to look at when we're trying to find a definition for the word art. Because people have in their minds an idea about what is going to happen at an art show. And there's a certain level of shared experience between every person that speaks English when I say that sort of thing. And, you know, none of them really includes video games. None of them really includes movies. None of them includes poetry. None of them really includes music or anything like that. They're all visual. They're all things like paintings. They're things like statues. They're things like set pieces. All of those sorts of ideas are things that run through people's heads when the word art is used. So It could be simply used to describe the category that be something that includes those elements as a category. It's just, it's paintings and it's statues, and they don't have to be aesthetically pleasing. They don't have to fit the dictionary definition of being appreciated for their beauty or emotional power. Or we could expand the number of things that they could be appreciated for. They could be appreciated for their, their controversial dealing of something or whatever. Like I said, I'm not actually here to create a definition, but I'm sort of going about the different ways that we could sort of view it and go about it. We could remove sort of that appreciation element to it, and simply say that it's paintings and it's statues, and that's it, which would probably leave a lot of people as being unhappy. We could say that it's paintings and statues. It's mostly paintings and statues or other visual representations, and then it's appreciated for its beauty or for its emotional impact or for its whatever. One of the things that we have to avoid is tautologies, and I think that there's a great temptation in the community of people who talk about art and conceptualize art to be tautological in this. Art is anything with artistic merit would be something that they eventually sort of lead back into. And this is an irrelevant definition. It's not useful, and it sort of relies on itself to define itself, and that just doesn't work there. So we need to find another definition for it that doesn't include that idea of artistic merit to it. And they can sort of fudge it around by saying it in any other sort of way, but ultimately what they're trying to communicate is that art is art because it has artistic merit. So I think that we do ultimately need to sort of get away from that idea of it having those sort of artsy qualities that we see in certain, for example, art films would be ones that contain elements that we see common in art. But there is certainly an idea that anything is art if it's sort of highbrow enough. I'm not necessarily sure I'm comfortable with that definition either. So I think that we might want to go away from that. And certainly to a certain extent, when I think about art, and I think when a lot of people think about art, they aren't necessarily thinking about the highest of brow art out there. So a bit of a difficult subject as far as all that goes. But yeah, that's ultimately all that I've really got to say about the topic of art and about the topic of language there. It's something that I've got a lot more to say in general, but this video is already running fairly long, and I've already had to sort of break it up in a couple spots to, take a breath, drink some water, get my throat clear, and revamp a few things. But ultimately, I think that's all that we've got to say there. So let's start talking a little bit about Persona 5. And this part, of course, is going to have a few spoilers, and that is going to be just the case of things. This one's going to focus mostly on Persona 5, since it doesn't have as much to do with Persona 4 or Persona 3. So yeah, like we're at the stage where we're dealing with the art museum there, that guy's art gallery sort of thing. First off, I have to just say, like, I'm really liking the characters here in this particular game. I had a little bit of a difficulty in the first character in Skull, just because he jumps into everything so quickly that you hardly get sort of an impression of him. I for a long time was sort of thinking of him as like Junpei Mark III, because he's very reminiscent of Yosuke and Junpei as a character, but he's sort of changing. Like, you're learning sort of a little bit more about him, and I can understand actually why he's Chariot now instead of Magician like the other two were. Also, I think he's growing on me a little bit, but these are the characters that never really stuck with me all that much. And this does include Chie from Persona 4. As much as she was a great character, she was never my favorite. But we are getting actually to a new character here, and like this is almost a custom-made character designed for me, because like not only is this a character that is very much like a White Fox-themed character, which is like just exactly what I am, who uses ice spells, I should point out. So like this guy basically is me here. But this character just in general just is so similar to how I am in a lot of situations. Like whenever they ask him a question that results in that requires him to answer, he always gives the most bizarre answers. Like he's just like, yeah, no, I think that weird is the natural way of things. It's like, hey, you see a talking cat, is that weird? And he's like, out of all the characters so far, he's just like, no, that seems okay. And everyone else was like, yeah, talking cat's weird, but he's just like, no, I'm fine with this. I also have a sort of personal thing about this. They try to give him like 4 different nicknames for his code name there, and he's just like, sure, to literally all of them. One of them is literally just like, we're going to call you Fried Tofu. And he's like, sure, okay. And, the rest of the team rejects it because it's such a stupid nickname. I actually am a little bit like that in that I've had a lot of nicknames that I've just accepted throughout my life. I mean, I've gone through like 9 grades where I've had teachers that just called me Stephanie. And I'm just like, sure, that's me, sure, yeah, fine. I mean, I was being sarcastic to a certain degree, but that's literally how I reacted to that. So, I mean, the fact that this guy is so blasé about people giving him bizarre nicknames just feels right up my alley. The fact that he's the Fox character is right up my alley. The fact that he's like the Ice Fox character is right up my alley. And he is actually using one of my sort of favorite pseudo mythical characters, which is Goemon, which is this ninja that beats people up with a pipe. Strangely enough, I'm not super into the story of Goemon from the actual mythology perspective, but I really liked the character Goemon from Mystical Ninja Star and Gomon on the N64. I always intended actually to read more about the actual historical figure, but there's surprisingly little that's available in English that I could find. All I do know is that he actually does run around beating people up with a gigantic reinforced metal pipe because he wasn't allowed to carry a sword. So, I mean, you have to understand that he's probably not the best ninja if he can't sneak a sword into a situation, but at the same time, it's pretty awesome that he's just carrying like I think it was like a 4-foot-long metal pipe that you could use for smoking. So it's just like, no, officer, I'm not carrying a weapon. This is a pipe for smoking, see? And they'd smoke through it. And then if the cop really got uppity about it, he'd just beat them up with his pipe. I mean, it's brilliant. But yeah, no, this character actually just is essentially what, he's my idealized self. This is who I want to be in my life. So yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I'm also seeing some things that are agreeing with my ideas about what a persona is and so on and so forth. When you talk to Morgana about the place just before you sort of go into the place with your new team member, Morgana describes that persona users can't have a shadow in the other world. And this is actually already contradicted in the canon of the series in that the persona users from Persona 4 and the persona users from Persona 3 actually encounter their shadows in Persona Ultimate Arena. So this, I think, actually does sort of contradict that. So Morgana is not necessarily a reliable narrator about the mechanics of the other world, the metaverse, I think she calls it. Or he calls it, actually. Well, it's hard to say with Morgana, actually, but when I did that, I just was like, are you a boy or a girl? And I'm like, maybe Morgana's a bus. And Morgana's just like, sure, that sounds possible. So yeah, I think that Morgana's also a great character, by the way. But yeah, I think that to a certain extent, we can't necessarily take anything that Morgana says as definitively canon, but we can use this as a lead-in for other comments. But yeah, Persona users apparently can't have a shadow, and I think that that's going to be revealed as false at some point throughout the series. But they can't have like a palace or a shadow on the other side. That isn't really something true to what Young has in terms of his mechanics, but I think that's partly true in terms of what Carl Jung talks about. When you have a persona, it stops people from viewing the shadow, and that is why to actually get to the shadow, to have that sort of discussion with yourself, you have to remove the persona. So I think that that's sort of leading into that idea there that these persona users still do have a shadow. It's just it's being covered up by the persona. So that's a possibility, or it could possibly be that Morgana actually it does have the knowledge about the sort of other universe there. So it's going to be interesting to see sort of where that direction goes. Still a lot of this game for me to get through, and I'm enjoying it quite a lot. The story is pretty good so far. It's interesting so far in that the villains in this one are a lot more hateable. The villains in Persona 3 and Persona 4, you didn't really get the feeling like they were actually that scummy, except for a very small number of them. But in this one, I think that they're definitely trying to go for that idea that all of them are on the inside, just completely rotten to the core. It'll be interesting to see how that sort of goes. But I think that does sort of weaken it to a certain degree, since it removes some of the complexity of the antagonists in this game compared to the other ones. But I think that it's a useful tool considering what the main conceit of it is, the sort of idea of stealing people's hearts who are scummy enough for you to go after them. Because, the team in Persona 4, for example, wasn't really going after anyone because of the way they acted. They were just trying to solve a mystery, for example. And, they keep finding these people who are technically guilty of it, and they keep saying, oh, no, you're actually fine because you didn't really... We're looking for someone else, go away. And in Persona 3, you weren't really looking for any person. It wasn't a person that was the problem. In this one, it is people that are the problem, and they're just sort of universally scummy. But we'll definitely see how that sort of goes. I'm also seeing some slight differences in the way that each of the personas reveals itself for the first time. In particular, the new character, Yusuke, his actually references things that are very different from the other characters, because he actually refers to, for example, justice as something that he's after, whereas the others are going for rebellion. And I'm kind of wondering if that's going to tie into some other elements of the character development or the character growth or the character ideas as we continue on. But maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. But yeah, definitely an interesting character, and I'm really liking this one so far. I'm wondering when the student council president joins your team, because they're definitely, if I recall correctly, she was in like the trailers. So I'm hoping that that's fairly soon. She seems like a fairly interesting character, and the sort of character that I could definitely relate to as well. That's one of the nice things about the Persona series. A lot of the characters are incredibly relatable. I find them... generally speaking, enjoyable people. I tend not to really relate to the people who follow like the magician or the chariot arcanas all that much, but there are a whole bunch of other ones like the priestess arcana. I tend to relate to those characters quite well. Justice characters I tend to relate to quite well. Emperor, Empress, I'm usually pretty okay with in terms of relating to them. In Persona 4, I actually kind of thought I could relate easily to the main character, and this one I'm having a little bit of a harder time with it, since he doesn't have sort of the sort of bizarre sensibilities, I guess, of the guy from Persona 4. I always chose the most bizarre answer that I possibly could in Persona 4. Same with Persona 3. Like, Persona 4 gave you the options. Like, you found, like, a single slice of bologna on a plate in the middle of the fridge. For some reason, you find it too intimidating, so you leave it alone. Like, that's one of the dialogue options. So there's something very strange about the character in Persona 4. That sort of strangeness doesn't seem to permeate into the character from Persona 5, which is a bit of a shame, because I thought that was pretty great, but I think we're starting to see a character who's taken that role and that position onto themselves instead. Persona 3, unfortunately, didn't have any characters that actually fit that particular mold, but that's perfectly fine. Every game has to have their own sort of thing going for them. But yeah, I'm going to continue playing. I'll get back to you guys next week. We'll be talking about probably... I'm not entirely sure what the topic of discussion is going to be next week. They'll possibly have something to do with what I play in the game. Might inspire me to do something. But yeah, just in summary, I think that for the discussion of whether or not games are art, it's a difficult and nuanced discussion, I think. And a lot of people on both sides of the argument are not treating it as a difficult, nuanced subject with real-world implications. And I think that we sort of need to take a very, very deep look at why it is that we're doing it and whether or not there are better alternatives to arguing for games being art. And you might have noticed from the way I'm talking about this, but personally, I don't view games as art because I actually do follow the very strict definition of it. But I also follow the sense of it to a certain extent, and am willing to concede that, abstract art is to many people what comes to mind when they think of the word art, and if you go to a gallery filled with abstract art, people will understand what you're talking about. So it's still effectively a tool of communication. It's still an effective tool of communication if it includes things like abstract art or Dadaist art or anti-art or anything like that. But it's not an effective tool at expressing video games. It's not a useful communication tool to say, I'm going to look at art and have people assume that you're talking about a video game there. So that's my particular stance on it. I think that there is definitely the possibility, though, for my opinion to change as people start using the word differently. But I don't think that there's a single person alive who, in all honesty, thinks of video games when they hear the word art. Or I don't think that they think about movies when they hear the word art. I don't think that they think about the word, about any of those other things when they think about art. I think they think about primarily paintings, sculptures, even if they're not aesthetic. So that's sort of my stance on it. But I think that is definitely going to change. So anyway, hope you found this video enjoyable. And of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.